What do a 15th century papal throne and the accounting ledgers of a modern-day drug cartel have in common? At first glance, absolutely nothing. The story of the Borgia family is typically presented to us as a classic drama of power, familial intrigue, and moral decay set against the backdrop of the dazzling Renaissance. But that's a convenient and very dangerous lie that obscures the truth. Because this isn't a story about politics. It's a cold, calculated business plan for seizing an entire state. It's not a chronicle of aristocratic struggles. It's the world's first blueprint for establishing a nationwide organized crime syndicate. I invite you to step beyond being mere spectators and become criminal analysts with me, to crack the Borgia code together and uncover how, behind a facade of art and humanism, a technology of power was forged, one that remains startlingly relevant even today. Let's transport ourselves for a single moment to Rome at the close of the 15th century. And the first thing to strike us isn't grandeur, but an overwhelming dissonance. The air here is thick and heavy. Within it, the pungent scent of frankincense and ancient parchment, drifting from hundreds of churches, mingles with the acrid stench of sewage from the Tiber and the foul odor of open markets, where everything from Parma ham to human lives is for sale. The peal of church bells, summoning the faithful to Mass, drowns beneath the thunder of mercenaries' hooves, the drunken shouts from taverns, and the barely audible whispers of conspiracies woven in dark alleyways. Rome at this time isn't a holy city. It's a seething cauldron where sanctity and vice don't merely coexist. They intertwine and grow into each other. Here, a master in his workshop paints a Madonna whose face will move future generations to tears, while just beyond his studio wall, an executioner breaks the bones of yet another enemy of a powerful cardinal. Here, humanists in their gardens discuss newly rediscovered Platonic dialogues, while just 100 meters away, gangs roam the streets, ready to slit a throat for a couple of copper coins. This is a world without shades of grey, a world of ultimate stakes, where a fall from the pinnacle of power doesn't mean resignation, but agonizing death. And ascension demands not talent, but an iron will and utter contempt for any rule save one. The victor takes all. The Eternal City had transformed into an arena where a bloody spectacle unfolded every single day. To grasp the logic of the people from this era, we must crack two key codes, two ideas deeply embedded in their consciousness. The first concept is virtù. But don't confuse this with Christian virtue. Renaissance virtù is a fierce, earthy energy. It's an alloy of talent, valor, cunning, and ambition. It's a person's capacity to impose their will upon the world, to bend circumstances to their advantage, regardless of moral obstacles. A person possessing virtù isn't a saint. They are the architect of their own destiny, akin to a god who molds reality from chaos. This very idea, this intoxicating sense of one's own power, obsessed all the titans of that era, from artists to condottieri. The second code is fortuna. Fate, luck, an unpredictable force depicted as a capricious woman or a spinning wheel. Fortuna is the primary adversary of the person with virtù. For a Renaissance individual, life itself is a duel against her. One might pray, one might hope for a miracle, but a true hero, in their view, doesn't await favors from Fortuna. He seizes her by the hair, he subjugates her to his will, he compels the wheel to spin in his favor. This eternal struggle between will and chance was the primary engine of history during that time. It justified the most audacious risks and the most monstrous deeds. And into this world, into this Rome governed by ancient aristocratic clans like the Orsini and Colonna, the Borgia burst forth. To grasp the shock they caused, imagine Wall Street with its centuries-old banks, traditions, and gentlemen's agreements. And suddenly, a brash, unknown tech startup from Silicon Valley crashes in. A startup that refuses to acknowledge any rules, using insider trading, hostile takeovers, and blackmail as its primary business tools. It doesn't try to fit into the system. It arrived to shatter it and seize the entire market for itself. The clash between the old Roman aristocracy and the Borgia family wasn't merely a struggle for power. It was a collision of two civilizations, two distinct business models. The Italian clans operated under customary feudal laws, employing dynastic marriages, military alliances, and unspoken codes of honor. The Borgias, however, introduced something utterly new: the ice-cold logic of efficiency, where there are no allies, only temporary partners, where every position is an asset and every person a resource to be either utilized or eliminated. They were the first to grasp that the papal throne wasn't a spiritual office, but the single most powerful asset in all of Europe. The starting gun, the very trigger that set off this entire chain of events, was a death. In July of 1492, Pope Innocent VIII passed away. For Rome, this wasn't a period of mourning. It was a signal for the grand game to begin. The city held its breath, because the election of a new pope wasn't a spiritual act. It was the most audacious and ruthless gamble one could make in the Christian world. On the line, absolute power, unimaginable wealth, and control over the fates of kings. Cardinals, representatives of the great Italian families, converged on Rome, each one envisioning themselves as the victor. The game was on. And in this game, there was one player whom all the others criminally underestimated. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, a Spaniard, an outsider. Yes, he was wealthy, and yes, he had served as vice-chancellor, essentially the head of the papal administration for nearly 35 years. But to the Italian aristocracy, he remained a parvenu, a barbarian from the Pyrenees. They saw him as just one of many contenders. They didn't understand that for all those decades, Rodrigo hadn't merely been an administrator. He was a quiet, patient spider, perched at the very center of the web of power, not just observing, but studying. He saw every crack in the system, every weakness, every secret passion, and every shameful debt of his cardinal colleagues. It was in his mind that an idea was born, one that was utterly revolutionary for its time. The idea was simple and monstrous in its simplicity. Stop playing by the rules. Stop trying to win sympathies, forge shaky alliances, and hope for the will of the Holy Spirit. The papal election needed to be approached like a corporate takeover. The papal throne wasn't a sacred office, it was the principal asset. The College of Cardinals wasn't a spiritual assembly, but a board of directors whose votes could and should be bought. But not just bought. A system of total dependency needed to be created. Rodrigo Borgia decided not just to bribe. He resolved to use his full arsenal: direct cash payments, blackmail with compromising documents he had meticulously collected for decades, and even buying up the debts of his rivals to transform them from opponents into puppets. The conclave of 1492 went down in history as the apotheosis of simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices. But it was far more than that. On the night before the decisive vote, an entire caravan of mules, laden with sacks of silver, passed through the streets of Rome. It was headed for the palace of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, whose vote was pivotal. This wasn't a secret bribe. This was a public theatrical gesture, a demonstration of power that told the others, I can buy not just your vote, I can buy your entire lineage, with all your palaces and lands. Borgia wasn't just handing out money. He was distributing the most lucrative posts in the church, abbacies, bishoprics. He behaved not like a candidate, but like a new CEO who pre-appoints his people to key positions. This had the effect of an exploding bomb. No one in the Italian world had anticipated such systemic, brazen, and total corruption. The cardinals were accustomed to intrigues, to the subtle game, to backroom deals. But they were unprepared for this blitzkrieg, for this financial special operation executed with the efficiency of a Medici trading house and the ruthlessness of a hired assassin. The shock wasn't that votes were being bought, that had been done before. The shock was that one man could buy the entire system outright, root and branch, transforming a sacred sacrament into a market auction where he was the only true bidder. Upon his election, taking the name Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia immediately began fulfilling his promises. The cardinal shareholders received their dividends, positions, palaces, money. Through this, he not only settled his accounts, but also forged a reputation as a man who, though devilishly, kept his word. He demonstrated that being on his side was incredibly profitable. At the same time, he sent a clear signal to everyone else. I set the rules in this city now. The old aristocracy, the Orsini and Colonna clans, watched this unfold with horror and loathing. They understood that not merely a new landlord had arrived in their ancestral home, a corporate raider had come calling. And this is where the true scale of his scheme becomes apparent. Seizing the papal throne wasn't the ultimate goal, it was merely the first step. For Rodrigo Borgia, the Holy See wasn't the culmination of a career, but a tool. A perfect, divinely sanctioned instrument for realizing his life's grand dream, to carve out a sovereign, hereditary kingdom for his family, for his children, from the patchwork quilt of Italian principalities. He intended to use the church's treasury as a personal bank account, the Pope's army as a private military company, and the absolution of sins as a commodity, all to build a Borgia dynasty. It was a plan that, in its sheer audacity, surpassed anything Italy had witnessed before. To understand how the Borgias achieved such success, we must disabuse ourselves of images of Renaissance schemers. This isn't politics we're examining. This is a flawlessly engineered mechanism, a veritable corporation, where the Vatican is the headquarters and the Pope the chief executive officer. And this corporation, let's call it Vatican Incorporated, had three key departments operating in perfect synchronicity. The finance department, headed by Alexander VI himself, the enforcement arm, led by his son Cesare, and the strategic mergers and acquisitions division, where his daughter Lucrezia was the prime asset. Let's peek under the hood and examine how the main engine of this machine, the finance department, operated. Its work was built on a principle as ingenious as it was depraved: the transformation of spiritual authority into cold, hard cash. Classic revenue streams, like taxes and the sale of indulgences, were mere background noise. The Borgias streamlined what had previously been only an occasional sin, simony. But they elevated it to an entirely new level. They didn't just sell existing offices, they created new positions, dozens of cardinalates, bishoprics, and abbacies, with the sole purpose of selling them to the highest bidder. It was akin to a modern central bank printing money out of thin air. In 1500, Alexander, with a single stroke of his pen, created 12 new cardinals, netting a colossal sum of 120,000 gold ducats. He transformed the College of Cardinals into a stock company, where the controlling interest was always his. But the true Borgia innovation, their unique business process, was a system that could be called hereditary planning through poisoning. It was a cold and perfectly calibrated assembly line of death and enrichment, operating in 4 phases. Step 1. The intelligence department, reporting directly to the Pope, identifies a target. This was usually a very wealthy, elderly cardinal whose estate, after death, was, according to church law, supposed to revert to the papal treasury. Step 2. The pharmaceutical department swung into action. The infamous Corella, the Borgia family poison, an arsenic-based compound, tasteless and odorless, was deployed. It was slipped into wine at a lavish banquet. Death followed within a few days, appearing as a severe stomach ailment or fever, a common occurrence in unsanitary Rome. Step 3. The legal department. The moment a cardinal breathed his last, the Pope's notaries would instantly seal his palace and meticulously inventory all his assets, gold, lands, and priceless works of art. By law, these vast holdings were transferred to the Holy See, but in practice they flowed directly into the personal coffers of the Borgia family. And finally, step 4. Reinvestment. These freshly acquired funds were immediately funneled into the Borgias' military machine, specifically into Cesare's army. And the now vacant, incredibly lucrative cardinalate was once again put up for sale. The cycle was complete. The cycle. This wasn't just a self-financing system. It was a perfect perpetual motion machine powered by human greed and fear. These weren't chaotic murders. This was pure business. Of course, financial might is worthless without muscle. And here, Cesare Borgia, head of the enforcement arm, stepped onto the stage. He wasn't merely a general. He was an instrument, a scalpel in his father's hand. Cesare's campaigns in Romagna weren't classic feudal wars. They were hostile corporate takeovers, Borgia style. Funded by the latest cardinal's liquidation, Cesare, with his mercenary army, the finest in Italy, would storm into the next city, depose the local ruler, and annex their lands to the family's burgeoning domain. His cruelty wasn't sadism, it was a calculated marketing strategy. By executing his treacherous lieutenants and displaying their dismembered bodies in the town square, he sent a crystal-clear message across all of Italy. Resistance was futile, betrayal fatal. Finally, the third element of this meticulously crafted system, Lucrezia Borgia. Within this family enterprise, she was the most valuable diplomatic asset. Her marriages weren't unions of hearts, but strategic mergers. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza secured an alliance with Milan and safety from the north. The moment the Sforzas outlived their usefulness, the marriage was annulled on the humiliating grounds of the husband's alleged impotence. A second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, was meant to cement an alliance with Naples. But as soon as the political winds shifted and the Pope forged an alliance with France, Naples' adversary, Lucrezia's husband, was simply butchered by Cesare's assassins right on the Vatican steps. Each of her marriages was a temporary contract, terminated the moment it ceased to be profitable. So, imagine this meticulously engineered machine in action. Alexander's intelligence network identifies a weak link. The poison does its work. The treasury swells. With these funds, Cesare hires soldiers and seizes yet another province. To fortify the new border, Lucrezia is married off to the ruler of a neighboring duchy. All the while, from the lofty perch of his throne, the Pope blesses these deeds, excommunicates enemies, and sells indulgences for the construction of cathedrals. This was no mere family. It was a perfectly synchronized syndicate where each family member performed a distinct function and every institution of the church was repurposed to serve a singular goal: absolute power and boundless wealth. We're talking about colossal sums, the conquest of entire provinces, the very destinies of kings. Yet behind every one of these grand events, behind every single entry in the Vatican's ledgers, stood a flesh-and-blood individual. Behind every poisoned cardinal wasn't some abstract Cantharella venom, but a servant whose hand never trembled as they poured the poison into the wine. Behind every conquered fortress stood a common mercenary who, for a few coins' wages, would charge into the assault, risking being boiled alive in scorching tar. A single dagger thrust in a darkened alley could shift Italy's political landscape for years to come, and that blow was delivered by an unnamed sicario, whose name never graced a single chronicle, yet whose actions were the final link in a long chain of commands emanating directly from the Vatican itself. And if we truly want to grasp how this system operated, we must look at the people who were its cogs and gears. The principal, most dependable component in Cesare Borgia's enforcement apparatus was a man named Micheletto Corella. A Spaniard, Cesare's childhood friend, his shadow, and his axe. In official documents, he was listed as a captain, but in essence, he was the head of security and the chief executor of the family's wet work. If Cesare was the architect of violence, then Micheletto was his foreman. It was he who personally oversaw the assassination of Lucrezia's second husband, Alfonso of Aragon. It was he, on Cesare's direct orders, who strangled Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo, the condottieri who had plotted to betray their master. Micheletto wasn't merely a brute, he was a consummate professional. He was the embodiment of absolute fanatical devotion, not to an ideology, but to a person. For him, moral categories simply didn't exist. There was no good or evil. There was only Cesare's command. This blind loyalty made him invaluable because in a world of rampant betrayal, where any ally could turn into an enemy, Micheletto was a constant. He was the dark side of Cesare's genius, his hands, which performed all the dirty work, leaving the Duke himself to bask in the shining armor of a conqueror and reformer. Without men like Micheletto, the entire Borgia strategy would have remained just a collection of impressive blueprints. But violence, that's only half the story. The other, equally crucial part of the machine operated in the quiet of the offices. These were the nameless clerks and financiers of the papal chamber, the Vatican's treasury. These men in their cassocks, bent over ledgers by the flickering light of tallow candles, were no less vital than Cesare's army. They transformed sin into cold, hard cash. They calculated the cost of a cardinal's hat, figured the commission for annulling an inconvenient marriage, and converted the proceeds from the sale of indulgences into jingling gold ducats, which were then immediately dispatched to pay Swiss mercenaries. They were the accountants of this colossal criminal enterprise, and their meticulous work ensured the smooth, uninterrupted circulation of the entire system's lifeblood. And here's one striking, everyday detail that best illustrates the atmosphere of the time. Picture a lavish feast in the apostolic palace. Exotic dishes grace the tables, the finest wines fill the goblets. Surrounding them are cardinals in their crimson robes, ambassadors, artists and poets. Music plays, and sophisticated conversations about philosophy unfold. But every powerful guest, and especially the Pope himself and his children, has an unseen companion, a personal food taster, a pregustator. Before Alexander VI's lips touched a drop of wine, this individual first had to drink from the very same goblet. Before Cesare even touched a piece of meat, the taster sampled it first. This wasn't a nod to tradition, it was a stark, chilling necessity. In the world the Borgia family built upon poison and betrayal, they themselves lived in constant, bone-chilling fear of being poisoned. They trusted only each other and a handful of fanatics like Micheletto. The Pope, who with a single papal bull could plunge entire kingdoms into war, could not be certain that his dinner wouldn't be his last. This small detail, the person whose sole job was to die in their master's stead, exposes the grim underside of their power. It was absolute, yet fragile. It was built on fear, but also thoroughly permeated by it, right down to its very foundations. Thus, behind the brilliant facade of a family of geniuses stood an entire army of unseen operatives, assassins ready to do anything for their patron, meticulous accountants turning faith into assets, and unfortunate tasters playing Russian roulette with every meal. Without these people behind the scenes, the grand drama of the Borgias would never have unfolded. The system seemed invincible. The financial pump worked without interruption. Cesare's army swept aside any resistance, and Lucrezia's marital alliances wove a web of diplomatic security. The Borgia machine, fine-tuned to perfection, devoured central Italy, city after city, province after province. But in the autumn of 1502, something happened that even the genius of Alexander VI could not have foreseen. The system collided not with an external enemy, not with a French army or a Spanish intrigue. The blow came from within, from the very heart of its enforcement arm. The perfect storm began at Magione Castle near Perugia. There, Cesare's principal captains, his condottieri, Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, Paolo Orsini, the Duke of Gravina, met in secret. These weren't mere mercenaries. These were wolves whom Cesare himself had hired and fed, the most dangerous, most ambitious, and most ruthless military commanders in all of Italy. And they realized a simple truth. The dragon they had helped raise had grown too large, and sooner or later, it would devour them too. They forged a secret alliance with the goal of destroying their creator. This was a mutiny on the ship, a revolt of the generals. Overnight, Cesare Borgia lost virtually his entire army. His best commanders, along with their troops, defected to the enemy. The cities he had just conquered immediately rose in revolt. In Urbino, the duke he had deposed returned in triumph. Fortresses once deemed impregnable opened their gates to the rebels. The meticulously constructed empire began to crumble like a house of cards. For the first time, the brilliant plan had faltered. The mechanism that had seemed eternal creaked to a halt. Cesare, the invincible Duke of Valentinois, found himself almost alone, trapped in the city of Imola with a handful of loyalists, surrounded on all sides by those who had sworn allegiance to him just yesterday. And here, the central paradox of the Borgia machine revealed itself. The very strength that fueled its rapid growth became its greatest vulnerability. Cesare didn't build his army on ideology or patriotism. He built it on the principles of efficiency. He hired the best professionals for top dollar. He created a coalition of predators united by a common goal: plunder. But predators have no concept of loyalty. There's only the instinct for self-preservation and the hunger for power. A system built on cynical calculation produced cynical operatives who, at the decisive moment, turned their master's logic against him. They simply recalculated the odds and decided that killing and plundering Cesare would be more profitable than serving him. The entire structure of Borgia power rested on two pillars: the Pope's money and Cesare's invincible army. Now, one of those pillars had collapsed. Enemies, lurking all across Italy, raised their heads, sensing the scent of blood. The old aristocracy, the Orsini and Colonna clans, saw their chance for revenge. Even allies like Florence adopted a wait-and-see attitude, in no hurry to aid the sinking duke. For the first time in 10 years, the Borgia family found itself on the brink of complete annihilation. Father and son stared catastrophe in the face. Alexander VI in Rome could only weave intrigues and try to gather new funds, but without an army, it was useless. And Cesare in the north was cornered. All he had left was his intellect, his reputation, and a few fanatically loyal individuals like Micheletto Corella. But what did that mean against the combined might of Italy's finest commanders? The world held its breath. Everyone was convinced that the Borgia star had set. It seemed the answer was obvious. Inevitable defeat and death awaited them. But it was precisely in this moment of desperation that Cesare would make a decision that would enter every textbook on political strategy and make Niccolo Machiavelli, observing these events, applaud the genius of a devil. How could a strategist, stripped of his primary instrument, his army, stand against an alliance of professional killers whom he himself had created? What could one oppose to betrayal when your entire system is built on an absence of trust? So, Cesare was trapped. But to understand what happened next, we need to step away from the traditional view of these events as a purely military conflict. Of course, there's a popular theory that Cesare simply outwitted his enemies, playing on their greed and disunity. That he was such a brilliant actor and psychologist that he managed to persuade the wolves to re-enter the cage. It's a compelling story, but it overlooks the main, hidden mechanism that truly controlled the situation: economics. Behind the scenes of this drama, it wasn't a battle of wits playing out, but a brutal financial war. An alternative perspective, championed by many economic historians today, posits that the condottieri conspiracy was doomed from the get-go. The reason wasn't Cesare's tactical brilliance, but rather the conspirators' own financial illiteracy. They were masterful soldiers, yet utterly hopeless when it came to business. Their armies devoured colossal sums for wages, provisions, and ammunition, and this money had to materialize somewhere right then and there. They could loot cities, but that only bled their resource base dry. They lacked access to any centralized financial system. Essentially, they were a cluster of feuding startups daring to challenge a monopoly. And this is precisely where the invisible hand of Alexander VI enters the fray. From his seat in the Vatican, he did what he did best. He unleashed an economic war. While Cesare played for time, feigning despair and a willingness to negotiate, his father in Rome launched a massive financial assault on the conspirators. First, he choked off all their credit lines. The bankers of Siena and Florence, bound to the Vatican by thousands of invisible threads, immediately received orders to cease all financing for the rebels. The condottieri, who had banked on quick loans to wage their war, suddenly found themselves staring at empty coffers. Second, the Pope wielded his ultimate trump card, spiritual authority as an economic weapon. He threatened excommunication for any city that dared to support the insurgents. And in those days, excommunication wasn't just a curse. It meant a complete trade embargo, the annulment of all debts, and a free pass for anyone to plunder merchants from that city. Just imagine the sheer scale of this operation. When Alexander the Great seized the Persian treasury in Susa, he acquired a sum equivalent to several years' worth of the combined budgets of all Greek city-states. But Alexander Borgia played a far more subtle game. He didn't capture a treasury, he controlled the entire financial system. Through church taxes, the sale of offices, and the colossal revenues from the Jubilee year of 1500, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims flocked to Rome, he amassed capital comparable to the budgets of Europe's mightiest kingdoms. With that kind of money, he could recruit not one, but 3 new armies. And while the rebellious condottieri scrambled to fund their detachments, the Pope, with a mere stroke of his pen, could transfer tens of thousands of ducats to enlist fresh Swiss and Gascon mercenaries. But most crucially, consider the symbolism of Cesare's actions once he sensed the financial noose tightening around his enemies' necks. He didn't threaten them. On the contrary, he initiated negotiations. He sent them letters brimming with remorse and goodwill. He admitted his mistakes, agreed to all their terms, and promised them new lands and even more money. He orchestrated the greatest performance of his life, proposing they meet in the small town of Sinigaglia for a final reconciliation and the signing of a new, even more lucrative contract tailored to their benefit. This move was far more than just a military stratagem. It was a political manifesto meticulously crafted to exploit their psychology. The condottieri were cynics. They didn't believe in friendship, but they held unwavering faith in contracts and profit. Cesare's offer was articulated in the only language they understood, the language of money. He didn't ask for loyalty. He offered them a deal. And they, whose armies were already grumbling over unpaid wages, whose financial resources were dwindling, saw salvation in this proposition. They concluded that their rebellion had triumphed, that they had brought the Borgias to their knees and could now dictate terms. Their own greed and economic short-sightedness blinded them. They marched into Sinigaglia not as conquerors, but as bankrupt businessmen heading to sign a debt restructuring agreement with their chief creditor. December 31st, 1502, the town of Sinigaglia. A cold winter fog clung close to the ground. Cesare Borgia greeted his former captains, now his mortal enemies, with open arms. He smiled, joked, behaving like a prodigal son returning to his father's embrace. The atmosphere was almost festive. The rebellious condottieri, blinded by avarice and certainty of victory, made a fatal error. They agreed to leave their troops outside the city walls and enter the palace for negotiations, accompanied by only a small retinue. They entered the hall, the doors swung shut behind them, and the smile vanished from Cesare's face. At that precise moment, his loyal Micheletto Corella and his men surrounded and disarmed their personal guard. The trap had sprung shut. What followed was no explosion of rage. It was a cold-blooded liquidation. Two of them, Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo, were personally strangled by Micheletto that very night with a garrote. The other two, from the powerful Orsini clan, Cesare kept alive for a few more weeks as hostages, until his father in Rome completed a parallel operation, arresting the family's chief enemy, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Orsini. As soon as word arrived that the cardinal was imprisoned, the remaining two captives in Sinigaglia were also executed. The operation was executed with impeccable, chilling synchronicity. This wasn't merely an act of revenge. It was the surgical removal of a cancerous tumor. And now, with the financial blockade organized from the Vatican, the psychological drama staged by Cesare, and the ruthless final stroke delivered by Micheletto, all laid bare, the picture becomes crystal clear. The Sinigaglia massacre isn't an isolated incident. It's a miniature model of the entire Borgia system at work. It's a perfect demonstration of how all the elements of their machine, money, deception, and violence function together as a single, well-oiled mechanism. They didn't merely conquer their enemies. They weaponized their foes' own weaknesses, their greed and disunity, against them. They economically forced them into self-destruction and then compelled them to willingly show up for their own execution. Let's recall everything we already know. Let's remember the assembly line of cardinal poisonings to replenish the treasury. Let's recall the cynical use of Lucrezia's marriages as a tool for forging temporary alliances. Let's remember the creation of new ecclesiastical posts solely for sale. None of this was mere isolated acts of cruelty or immorality. These were details of one grand project, links in a single chain. And the Sinigaglia massacre was the culmination, the moment when all these threads converged, revealing to the world the true nature of Borgia power. So, what is the secret to the Borgia phenomenon? They weren't simply more cruel or more ambitious than their contemporaries. Their genius lay elsewhere. They were the first in history to completely desacralize power. They looked at the state, at the church, at politics itself, and saw not a divine establishment, not a sacred right, but merely a business. A highly profitable, high-risk, but still a business. They created and implemented the world's first technology for transforming power into an asset. Their primary discovery was the cold, ruthless algebra of power, where there was no place for honor, friendship, or religion, only debits and credits, profits and losses. All their adversaries, the old Roman aristocracy, the rebellious condottieri, still lived within a feudal paradigm. They thought in terms of familial honor, personal loyalty, military alliances. They played a complex yet predictable game. The Borgias, however, came from a different world. They brought with them the logic not of an aristocrat, but of a merchant and a banker. In their world, an ally was a temporary business partner. An enemy was an inefficient asset slated for liquidation. Murder was not a sin, but a tool for hostile takeover. They didn't break the rules of the old game. They played an entirely new game whose rules no one else knew. Realizing this fact changes everything. Niccolo Machiavelli, who witnessed these events as a Florentine ambassador, did not invent his prince out of thin air. He merely meticulously documented the operational methods of Cesare Borgia. Cesare became the living embodiment of the idea that to achieve and retain power, absolutely all means are fair game. That morality is a luxury a ruler cannot afford. That fear is a far more reliable foundation for power than love. And this is no longer just politics, nor merely war. This is a design of titanic, almost diabolical scale. It is an attempt to reconstruct the very foundation of society, replacing old codes of honor and faith with a new universal law, the law of pure efficiency. The Borgias didn't just want to establish a dynasty. They were, consciously or not, creating the prototype of a new, modern state, centralized, pragmatic, amoral, and absolutely omnipotent. They were the architects of a matrix of power that would outlive them by centuries. The Borgia Empire collapsed almost instantaneously after the death of Alexander VI in August of 1503. In a cruel twist of fate, both the Pope and his son Cesare fell gravely ill after a feast, sparking the legend that they had accidentally consumed poisoned wine intended for yet another cardinal. Alexander died, and Cesare, though he survived, was too weak to cling to power. Without his father's money and authority, his empire crumbled. The enemies he had humiliated for years returned with a vengeance. Enemy number one became Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who ascended to the papal throne as Julius II. He methodically dismantled everything the Borgias had built. Cesare lost all his lands, was arrested, and eventually perished in an obscure skirmish in Spain. It seemed the family's story had ended in complete oblivion. But that's merely an illusion. While the world physically annihilated the family, it couldn't destroy their technology. The domino effect unleashed by the Borgias rippled across Europe, fundamentally altering the very nature of power. It was their methods, the centralization of administration, the creation of a professional army, the subjugation of the church to state interests, and the savvy use of propaganda that became the gold standard for absolute monarchs. French kings, English Tudors, Spanish Habsburgs, all of them, consciously or not, became pupils of the Borgias. They grasped the crucial lesson. A powerful state is built not on divine right, but on money, military might, and the control of information. The Borgias were the detonator that blew apart the old feudal world and cleared the ground for the construction of modern nations. We still live in a world profoundly shaped by their legacy, often without even realizing it. Take, for instance, the word nepotism. Today, we use it to describe favoritism, the handing out of positions to relatives. But the word itself stems from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew. It was the Renaissance popes, and Alexander VI foremost among them, who pushed this practice to its absolute extreme, doling out the juiciest slices of the ecclesiastical pie to their illegitimate children and nephews. When we rail against corruption today, we speak a language largely forged to describe the deeds of the Borgia family, or consider intelligence gathering. It was the Borgias who established one of Europe's first systematic spy networks. Their agents operated in every royal court, in every major city. They didn't merely collect information, they recruited supporters, spread rumors, and waged psychological warfare. Modern intelligence agencies, with their complex disinformation and influence operations, are direct descendants of this system, where knowledge is a weapon and a word can kill as surely as a dagger. Even in art, their imprint proved indelible. Commissioning works from Pinturicchio and other masters, they used art not to glorify God, but to glorify themselves. The Borgia apartments in the Vatican are not just frescoes. They are one of history's earliest examples of monumental political propaganda designed to assert the family's divine right to rule. Yet, their legacy holds a crucial paradox. Rodrigo Borgia's initial vision was to forge a hereditary kingdom in central Italy for his family line. He yearned for stability, to establish a dynasty that would reign for centuries. But the methods he employed to achieve this, total cynicism, betrayal, and reliance on fleeting mercenaries, birthed a system inherently incapable of enduring. It was too deeply intertwined with the personalities of its architects. The moment the brilliant strategist Alexander died, and the equally brilliant executor Cesare was neutralized, the entire edifice crumbled instantly. Thus, in their relentless pursuit of perpetual power for their family, the Borgias crafted a perfect instrument for its seizure, yet an utterly unsustainable model for its retention. Their grandest creation, the technology of absolute power, proved to be a weapon that annihilated both them and their dream. The very notion of building a stable state on a foundation of total mistrust and betrayal inverted upon itself, unleashing even greater chaos. And therein lies their central tragic lesson. What is built on sand cannot long endure, even if that sand is mixed with blood and gold. It might seem that the story of the Borgia family is merely an exotic thriller from a distant past, a dusty exhibit in the Museum of Human Vices. But this is a perilous misconception, because the operating system they engineered hasn't vanished. It still runs today, simply on new hardware. Today's political strategists, who obliterate reputations with damaging information and smear campaigns, are the direct heirs of Alexander VI's espionage network. Corporate raiders who dismantle companies through legal loopholes and hostile takeovers operate with the same logic that Cesare employed when seizing the cities of Romagna. The information wars waged across social media with bots and fake news are merely a modern iteration of the rumors Borgia agents scattered throughout Europe. They've updated the interface, but not the core. Their story builds a direct bridge to one of the most pressing issues of our time, the fusion of state power with private predatory interests. The Borgias were the first to starkly demonstrate that the state can become the most effective instrument not for public good, but for organized crime. That institutions designed to protect citizens can be reconfigured to plunder them. When we witness today how entire sectors of the economy fall under the sway of a narrow group, how laws are crafted to serve corporate interests rather than the public's, we can almost see the ghost of Rodrigo Borgia smiling over our shoulder. He was the first to grasp that the biggest prize isn't robbing a bank, but seizing control of the state itself, the very entity that prints money. So, what is the principal, non-trivial lesson we can glean from this history? Of course, one could argue that power corrupts, or that the ends don't justify the means. But these are overly simplistic notions that fail to explain their phenomenal success. The lesson is far deeper and more terrifying. The Borgia story is a dire warning about the mortal peril of pure efficiency when divorced from all ethics and morality. It's a tale of what transpires when the question of how to seize power, how to eliminate a foe, how to grow richer, completely eclipses the question of why. The Borgias built a perfect machine. Every cog, every lever within it functioned flawlessly. But this machine had no purpose beyond endless self-perpetuation. It served neither God, nor the people, nor even any grand ideal. It served only itself. And the moment the technology of power becomes an end in itself, it inevitably begins to devour everything around it, including its own creators. It's a virus that transforms any healthy organism, be it a state, a corporation, or a society, into a cancerous growth. The Borgia phenomenon isn't that they were villains. History has known far more bloodthirsty tyrants. Their uniqueness lies in being the first true technologists of power. They approached human governance with the cold logic of an engineer assembling a mechanism without contemplating its ultimate purpose. They weren't demons. They were ultimate, absolute pragmatists. And that is precisely why they remain so contemporary and so terrifying. And in this lies the preliminary summary of their journey. The grand and tragic saga of the Borgia family serves as an eternal reminder that any system, any ideology, any technology, no matter how brilliant or efficient, is doomed to become a beautiful, complex, and ultimately self-destructive prison if it leaves no room for the simple human dimension, for something greater than a mere thirst for power. Up to this point, we've viewed this history through the eyes of the victors, marveling at the Borgias' diabolical efficiency. But to grasp the full depth of the drama, we must undertake an intellectual reversal and see the world from another perspective, from the palace of the Orsini clan or the cell of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. And the first thing we must do is discard the caricatured image of old money as stagnant, foolish aristocrats. That simply isn't true. The Orsini, the Colonna, the della Rovere, these were not merely noble families. They were Rome itself. They were its immune system, its centuries-old tradition, its unwritten constitution. Their families had ruled these hills since the ancestors of the Borgias herded goats in Valencia, Spain. They considered themselves not just owners of the city, but its custodians. Their perpetual feuds, their intrigues, their street clashes. To us, this might appear as chaos, but to them, it was a means of maintaining equilibrium. It was an intricate, ritualized dance of power that prevented any single clan from seizing absolute authority and shattering the fragile balance. They were wolves, fighting each other for territory, but they understood they were all part of the same forest. The Papal See was the ultimate prize in their game, yet even upon securing it, they played by certain rules because they knew tomorrow the wheel of fortune would turn and a former enemy might become a necessary ally. And into this orderly, albeit brutal world, the Borgias burst forth. From the perspective of a Roman aristocrat, this was not just an invasion by competitors, it was an invasion by barbarians. Imagine their cultural shock. Here was Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander. He spoke Latin with a rough Catalan accent. He made no secret of his children. He openly brought them into politics. He hosted feasts in the Vatican palace that more closely resembled pagan orgies. His ambitions were not cloaked by a fig leaf of piety or service to the church. They were absolutely naked, primal, vulgar. He did not behave like the vicar of Christ. He behaved like a lucky merchant who had stumbled upon untold riches. And his children? Cesare. To the Roman nobility, accustomed to the rituals of war, to the condottiere's code of honor, he was a monster. He didn't issue challenges to duels, he hired assassins. He didn't forge alliances, he bought temporary accomplices. His massacre at Sinigaglia for Machiavelli was a stroke of genius, but for the old aristocracy, it was unthinkable. To kill men who had arrived for negotiations under a banner of peace was a violation of all codes, all notions of honor, even the honor of a brigand. It was total barbarism. And Lucrezia? She was used as a bargaining chip. Her marriages were contracted and dissolved with the cynicism of a cattle dealer. For the Orsini clan, where marriage was a sacred union of two lineages spanning generations, such treatment of one's own daughter signaled not just amorality, but monstrous, alien savagery. In the eyes of their enemies, the Borgias were more than mere people. They were a virus, a disease that was destroying the very organism of Rome. The old clans were predators who could wound, kill, but they operated within a comprehensible ecosystem. The Borgias, however, recognized no boundaries. They poisoned cardinals for money. They transformed sacred sacraments into commodities on the market. They shattered all the unwritten laws that made life in this harsh world even remotely predictable. They were an absolute, unfathomable evil because their logic was utterly foreign to their adversaries. And in this lies the tragedy of predictability. The old aristocracy found themselves unprepared to fight the Borgias, not because they were weaker or dumber. Rather, their thinking was shackled by centuries of tradition. They were preparing for another feudal war, for a complex chess game of intrigues, alliances, and betrayals. But the Borgias didn't play that chess game. They simply overturned the board, took all the pieces for themselves, and then struck their opponent over the head with the board itself. Their greatest strength, their history, their code of honor, their belief in the immutability of certain rules became their Achilles' heel. They simply couldn't fathom anyone going so far, violating every conceivable and inconceivable taboo. They tried to counter a financial blitzkrieg with hereditary armies. They attempted to oppose total cynicism with notions of honor. They were doomed because they tried to fight by rules against an adversary for whom rules fundamentally did not exist. They were the last dinosaurs of the old world, swept away by the icy meteorite of a new, pragmatic, and ruthless era. It's commonly believed that the Borgias' strength lay in their ironclad family unity. In a world where no one could be trusted, they trusted each other. This legend of clan loyalty is the most successful myth they ever created. Because in reality, their history is a tragedy about how a grand ambition, a dream of dynasty, compelled them to sacrifice the most precious thing they possessed, each other. And the most telling act of this internal cannibalism was the murder of Alfonso of Aragon, Lucrezia's second husband. This wasn't just another political assassination. Alfonso was not merely an ally, he was part of the family. Lucrezia, by all accounts, genuinely loved him. Their marriage was an island of normal human life in that sea of intrigue. But the political winds shifted. Alexander and Cesare forged a new, more advantageous alliance with the King of France, who was a mortal enemy of the Aragonese dynasty of Naples. And overnight, Lucrezia's beloved husband transformed from a valuable asset into a dangerous impediment. The decision was made with chilling pragmatism. Alfonso had to be removed. First, mercenaries attacked him on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Gravely wounded, he survived. Lucrezia personally nursed him in the Vatican apartments, even preparing his food herself, fearing poison. For a brief moment, it seemed human feelings might prevail. But it was an illusion. One evening, when Lucrezia had left the room for a moment, the loyal Micheletto Corella entered the chambers. He simply brushed aside the guards with the words, "It is ordered," and strangled the wounded prince in his own bed. For Cesare and Alexander, it was merely a clearing of the political chessboard. For Lucrezia, it was a catastrophe that shattered her. She understood the terrible truth. In the eyes of her father and brother, she was not a daughter and sister, but a tool whose feelings and life held no significance compared to the family's interests. Let's try to peer into the inner world of Alexander VI. How could a father, who undoubtedly adored his children, so coldly sacrifice his daughter's happiness? The answer lies in the poisonous nature of absolute power. Upon ascending to the papal throne, Rodrigo Borgia ceased to be merely a man. He became a function, an operator of the gigantic machine he himself had built. And this machine demanded constant fuel, money, alliances, lands. Gradually, the initial goal, the family's well-being, faded into the background. The primary objective became the maintenance of the machine's own operation. He fell into the trap of his own system. The burden of responsibility, the perpetual dread of betrayal, the chilling isolation at the apex of power where every smile was a mask, all inexorably transformed him. He devolved from a pleasure-seeking dilettante into a paranoiac pragmatist. The tender luxury of pure paternal affection was an indulgence he could no longer afford. His love curdled into something possessive and perverse. He adored his offspring not as individuals, but as his crowning achievements, flawless instruments to execute his grand designs. Cesare was destined to be his perfect blade, Lucrezia his flawless diplomatic key. Any flicker of their own will, any genuine emotion, was perceived as a glitch in his meticulously crafted program, a fatal flaw in his perfect machinery. And perhaps the most heartbreaking sacrifice upon this altar of ruthless ambition was, inevitably, Lucrezia herself. Her life story reads like a grim ledger, detailing the staggering human cost of the Borgias' vaulting aspirations. Her initial marriage to Giovanni Sforza was forged to secure an alliance with Milan. When that political bond proved unprofitable, her husband was publicly disgraced and cast aside. Her second, blissful union with Alfonso of Aragon was brutally shattered to facilitate a new alliance with France. Her third, to Alfonso d'Este, was mandated to fortify the northern frontiers of Cesare's burgeoning domain. Her body, her reputation, her very heart, all were ruthlessly expended, raw materials for the Borgias' grand enterprise. The true darkness of the Borgia genius lay not in their cruelty towards foes. It resided in their chilling capacity to surgically excise human emotion from their own souls. They were brilliant strategists, but utterly monstrous individuals. For at some critical juncture, they truly embraced the chilling doctrine that the end justified any means. And so, having forged an empire, they ultimately lost the one thing for which perhaps all this grand design was initially conceived, their own family, as a community of loving souls. Instead, they transformed it into the soulless, bloodthirsty board of directors of a ruthless corporation. When the Spanish Borgia clan finally seized control of Rome, it was far more than a mere transfer of power. It heralded the seismic collision of two distinct civilizations, two colossal tectonic plates grinding against each other. Initially, there was no synthesis, only a rigid, irreconcilable conflict. This friction manifested in every facet of life, from language to architecture. Picture, if you will, the Vatican, the beating heart of the Latin world, where for centuries the polished, melodious cadences of Italian prelates had echoed through hallowed halls. Then, abruptly, its ancient corridors were filled instead with the guttural, sharp cacophony of the Catalan dialect. The Spaniards Rodrigo brought with him swiftly occupied pivotal positions in the administration, the army, and even the Pope's personal guard. To the Romans, this felt like nothing less than a cultural invasion. Nowhere was this cultural clash more striking than in matters of religion and morality. While the Italian aristocracy was undeniably cynical and decadent, its vices were artfully cloaked beneath a thick veneer of elegance, ritual, and high art. This was sin that understood its boundaries, adhering to a certain decorum. The Borgias, however, ushered in what the Romans considered outright vulgarity. They didn't merely transgress, they did so brazenly, with an almost defiant lack of discretion. Alexander did not conceal his children. He elevated them to cardinals and dukes for all to see. Cesare didn't merely assassinate rivals in the shadows, he did so with theatrical, undeniable display. This blatant refusal to abide by the unspoken rules of elegant hypocrisy, which formed the very bedrock of Roman high society, shocked and repelled the old elite far more profoundly than the actual transgressions themselves. Yet, from the crucible of this fierce collision, this cultural clash, something utterly novel and strangely potent began to emerge. Hybrids. Foremost among these was a radical new style of governance, aptly dubbed the Spanish method on Italian soil. The Borgias grafted Spanish ruthlessness, pragmatic directness, and fierce clan loyalty onto the ancient, incredibly intricate administrative machinery of the Papal States. The result was a political mutant, a system that wielded the lightning efficiency and lethal speed of a Spanish rapier, yet commanded the boundless financial and ideological resources of the entire Catholic Church. It was a force unlike anything seen before, truly unprecedented and utterly deadly. Another astonishing hybrid to emerge was Cesare Borgia's army. This was no typical Italian force, patched together from squabbling contingents of condottieri whose loyalties shifted with the wind. Cesare forged the first truly international professional army on the Italian peninsula. Its ranks boasted Spanish foot soldiers, renowned for their unflinching resolve, French heavy cavalry, Swiss masters of the pike, and Italian engineers, the uncontested global leaders in siege warfare technology. This was a meticulously engineered war machine, assembled from Europe's finest martial components, bound not by fragile feudal fealty, but by hard currency and the fierce personal devotion to the genius of its commander. This fearsome hybrid army tore through traditional Italian militias with the savage efficiency of a wolf scattering a flock of sheep. How then did life change for the common person suddenly caught in the cross-currents of these two civilizations? For the ordinary Roman, life became simultaneously more terrifying and, paradoxically, more orderly. On the one hand, the streets teemed with foreigners, Spanish soldiers who behaved like conquerors, and Cesare's enigmatic agents, the sicarios, who could butcher anyone at a mere whispered command from their master. The old system of patronage, where one might find sanctuary with a powerful neighbor from the Orsini or Colonna families, utterly collapsed. Now, there was only one master in the city, and he was alien and utterly unpredictable. On the other hand, the Borgias, with an iron fist, crushed the street wars between the ancient aristocratic clans that had terrorized the city for decades. They established a ruthless monopoly on violence. For a shopkeeper or artisan, this meant they were no longer subjected to random plundering by gangs loyal to various barons. Now, the state extracted its due centrally through taxes, but at least predictably. The familiar old rituals of city life, tied to the feast days of local saints and noble families, vanished. They were replaced by new, lavish, and boisterous celebrations glorifying the Borgia family. For those who were ambitious and unburdened by conscience, new avenues for social mobility opened up. Where previously a career demanded noble birth and the patronage of an Italian cardinal, the new regime's primary criterion was usefulness to the new power. A talented engineer, a merciless mercenary captain, a cunning lawyer, anyone could ascend if they proved their loyalty and effectiveness. The old aristocracy of blood gave way to a nascent meritocracy of talent and ruthlessness. Rome transformed into a crucible where ancient traditions were consumed by fire, and from the ashes rose a new, brutal, and pragmatic world that we now call the High Renaissance. The Borgias were not simply masters of poison and daggers, they were pioneers of information warfare. Alexander VI was among the first to grasp that public opinion was as vital a resource as gold or soldiers, and that it could and must be managed. He meticulously crafted a narrative of his family as divinely chosen restorers of order. The Great Jubilee of 1500 became his crowning propaganda triumph. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who flocked to Rome saw not a dissolute pope, but a powerful pontiff granting absolution, restoring churches and imposing order with an unyielding hand. And for those who remained in the Vatican, he commissioned an eternal testament to his grandeur, the Borgia apartments, frescoed by Pinturicchio. These were not mere paintings, they were a political manifesto where biblical narratives subtly intertwined with the family's history, and their heraldic bull stared from virtually every square foot, asserting their power as something immutable and everlasting. Cesare, in turn, transformed violence into a masterful public relations tool. His ruthlessness was never arbitrary. It was always a calculated spectacle with a clear message. The most vivid illustration is the tale of his governor in Romagna, Ramiro de Lorca. First, Cesare ordered Ramiro to pacify the rebellious province using the most brutal methods imaginable. Once order was brutally restored and the populace detested the governor, Cesare rode into the town of Cesena as a liberator. One morning, the townspeople awoke to find Ramiro de Lorca's body, gruesomely dismembered into two halves, displayed alongside a blood-soaked chopping block in the main square. With this single chilling gesture, Cesare achieved everything. He demonstrated his commitment to justice, shifted all blame for the preceding brutality onto his subordinate, and instilled paralyzing terror in anyone who might consider defying him. This wasn't merely an execution, it was a front-page headline in the most impactful medium of the era, the town square. But for every act of propaganda, counter-propaganda inevitably arose. The Borgias' enemies, spearheaded by Cardinal della Rovere, understood they couldn't defeat them solely on the battlefield. They needed to utterly demolish their reputation, to forge a black legend that would outlive them all. They seized upon the Borgias' genuine transgressions, their corruption, their debauchery, their brutality, and inflated them to apocalyptic, almost supernatural proportions. They didn't just accuse the Pope of having a mistress, they gleefully spread rumors of monstrous incest between father, son, and daughter. From this dark tapestry of smear campaigns emerged the most enduring myths, tales that have persisted to our present day and are now firmly woven into popular culture. We have the lurid story of the Chestnut Banquet, an alleged Vatican orgy featuring 50 courtesans. There's the legend of Cesare's ring, complete with a secret poison reservoir. And of course the principal calumny aimed at Lucrezia, the image of a serial poisoner dispatching her husbands and lovers with chilling efficiency. These stories were so vividly monstrous that they proved far more resilient than the mundane historical truth. We still see their echoes in films, television series, and video games, where the Borgias appear not as complex historical figures, but as almost demonic comic book villains. And here's a classic example of how history is indeed written by the victors. In June of 1497, the body of Juan Borgia, Pope Alexander's eldest and most beloved son, the Duke of Gandia, was fished from the Tiber River. The murder remained unsolved. Yet, after the family's fall from grace, the official and widely accepted narrative became that he was murdered by his own brother, Cesare. The motive? Envy of Juan's military triumphs and their father's affection. This narrative perfectly fit the image crafted by their enemies. Cesare as a ruthless, fratricidal monster willing to commit any atrocity for power. This version became canon. However, if we peel back the layers of the victor's propaganda, the picture becomes far less clear-cut. Juan Borgia, arrogant, debauched, and a prodigious gambler, had more enemies than friends in Rome. He could have been killed by a cuckolded husband, perhaps from the Orsini clan, with whom Juan had an open feud. He could have been cut down by creditors to whom he had lost vast sums. There is no direct evidence whatsoever proving Cesare's guilt. But after Alexander's death and the ascension of his bitterest enemy, Julius II, this particular version became the only truth. Why? Because it allowed for the retroactive demonization of the entire family, painting them as a nest of vipers devouring one another. An unsolved murder thus transformed into a potent weapon of information warfare, and the shot fired in the 15th century still reverberates through our understanding of that era. After the bloodbath at Sinigaglia, Cesare Borgia stood at the zenith of his power. He hadn't merely won, he had achieved the impossible, transforming certain defeat into his greatest triumph. At this moment, he faced a pivotal crossroads. One path beckoned him to halt, to consolidate his hold on the conquered Romagna, to begin constructing institutions, roads, and fostering trade, to evolve from a ruthless conqueror into a stable ruler, to finally realize his father's original, audacious vision, to create a robust, stable, modern state in the heart of Italy. But Cesare chose a different route. He decided not to stop, ever. And this proved to be a fatal decision, a point of no return where a grand vision was irrevocably betrayed. What then was this betrayal? It was the moment the goal, the creation of a state, ceased to justify the means. The means, war, conquest, accumulation, became ends in themselves. The machine of conquest he had so brilliantly engineered developed a will of its own, demanding an endless supply of fresh fuel. Cesare became addicted to his own success, to the intoxicating adrenaline of victory. Instead of strengthening ties with his neighbors, he began to threaten Florence. Instead of securing the support of mighty Venice, he brazenly challenged it. The initial, albeit cynical, blueprint for state building degenerated into a personal, insatiable, selfish hunger. Cesare ceased to be an architect. He became a cancerous cell, capable only of uncontrolled growth until it ultimately destroyed both itself and the organism it inhabited. This internal schism, this chasm between creation and destruction, is best illustrated by the story of a short-lived alliance. In the year 1502, a man named Leonardo da Vinci joined the service of Cesare Borgia as his chief military engineer. To Leonardo, the quintessential creative genius, Cesare was the living embodiment of the Renaissance ideal of virtù. He saw in him not a tyrant, but a titan, a man who, from the bloody chaos of the Romagna, was forging a new, ordered state. Leonardo was captivated by this sheer energy, the grandeur of this vision. He saw in Cesare a kindred spirit, an engineer just like himself, but one who built not machines, but human society. For Cesare, Leonardo devised blueprints for impenetrable strongholds, designed innovative siege engines, and drew maps of a hitherto unseen accuracy. It was a partnership of two of the era's greatest minds, a potent fusion of art and power, seemingly bent on creation. Leonardo believed he was helping to construct a new, better world, one more rational and secure. He was prepared to lend his genius to the man he believed could bring to life the dream of an ideal state. But gradually, Leonardo began to see the true colors of his benefactor. He saw not a builder, but a destroyer. He witnessed his ingenious inventions being employed not for defense, but for increasingly bellicose assaults. The rational plan was morphing into an obsession. And the final straw, most likely, was Cesare's scheme to capture Florence, Leonardo's hometown, the very birthplace of the Renaissance, the vibrant heart of art and humanism. At that very moment, the architect of creation realized he was serving unadulterated destruction. And in the spring of 1503, Leonardo da Vinci silently, without explanation, departed Cesare's service. This quiet exit was his loudest condemnation. It was a symbolic rupture between the creative genius of the Renaissance and its dark, predatory underbelly. The symbolic act that underscored this pivotal moment was the very threat looming over Florence. This was no mere military objective. Florence was a symbol. To attack her meant not simply to conquer a city, but to declare war on culture itself, on the very zeitgeist of the era. It was a gesture that revealed Cesare's utter disregard for sanctity, that art, philosophy, and beauty were nothing more than dust on his boots. He was prepared to torch the greatest library for a mere tactical advantage and to demolish Brunelleschi's magnificent Duomo to clear a path for his cannons. This was the definitive betrayal of the enlightened monarch ideal. The mask had fallen. The world saw not a new Romulus, founder of a great state, but a new Attila, the scourge of God, whose sole purpose was expansion for expansion's sake. From that moment on, the collapse of his empire was only a matter of time. A system devoid of any transcendent creative aim, it had morphed into a mere engine for converting the world into chaos and was inevitably destined to consume itself. When the Borgia Empire imploded, the apparent victors were those who had been defeated 10 years earlier. The old Roman aristocracy, the Orsinis, the Colonnas, the Della Roveres, returned from exile in triumph. Spanish officials and soldiers were either expelled or hunted down and slaughtered in the streets of Rome. It seemed as though the city had simply expelled an alien presence and life would settle back into its accustomed aristocratic groove. But this was an illusion. The true victor was not a class, but one man, Giuliano della Rovere, who ascended to become Pope Julius II. And he had absorbed the primary lesson from his enemies. To control the wolves, you must be the strongest wolf in the pack. He did not permit the old nobility to revert to their internecine squabbles. He himself became the new, absolute predator. Thus, the new elite that replaced the Borgias was, in fact, the old, but it was now compelled to submit to a centralized papal authority that governed with methods honed to perfection by his predecessor. The economy of the new Rome was literally forged from bones. Julius II inherited not merely the papal throne, he inherited the entire Borgia business empire. The Vatican treasury brimmed with gold, much of it confiscated from poisoned cardinals. And most importantly, he inherited Cesare's crown jewel, a unified and pacified Romagna. In a cruel twist of fate, Cesare, who shed rivers of blood to establish a kingdom for his kin, had actually been toiling for his bitterest enemy. He had been a veritable bulldozer, sweeping away dozens of petty tyrants to forge a single centralized state. All Julius II had to do was step in and claim this ready-made asset. Far from dissolving this state, he strengthened it, transforming it into the bulwark of the military and financial might of the Papal See. The gargantuan resources amassed by the Borgias didn't primarily fund the construction of temples or the patronage of the arts. They flowed into the same coffers as before, war. Julius II, dubbed the Warrior Pope, continued Cesare's policies of conquest, albeit under the banner of the Church. The trade routes remained unaltered, only the one collecting their tolls changed. The epicenter of power stayed exactly where it was, in Rome, but now it was even more consolidated and aggressive. The economic engine, originally designed to enrich a single family, was simply retuned to serve the ambitions of a single pope. The system endured, only the beneficiary shifted. The Borgias had forged an instrument, and Julius II eagerly wielded it to carve out an even grander state for the church than Cesare had ever dreamed of. So, what was the psychology of the survivors? For the Roman elite, the initial months after Alexander's death were a time of euphoria. The plague had passed, the Spanish accent vanished from the streets, and people could finally breathe freely again. But this jubilation quickly gave way to anxiety. People realized the monster hadn't died. It had simply changed masks. A genius of intrigue had been replaced by a genius of war. Instead of poison and clandestine assassinations, there came open, brutal military expansion. For the inhabitants of the Romagna, whom Cesare had first conquered and then governed with harsh but effective control, liberation often meant the return of old, petty and capricious tyrants whose levies were far more chaotic than the centralized plunder of the Borgias. But the most significant shift that occurred in people's minds was the final and irreversible death of illusions. A decade of Borgia rule had stripped the papacy of its last vestiges of sanctity. The entire world witnessed that the Holy See was not a spiritual institution, but a marketplace where everything was for sale, including absolution and cardinals' hats. This fostered a profound cynicism that permeated every fiber of Italian society. If the Vicar of Christ was merely a common brigand, then who could anyone truly trust? If holiness was a commodity, was anything truly sacred? This collective trauma, this sense of moral bankruptcy, would become the fuel that, just a few years later, would ignite Europe in the fires of the Reformation. The society that emerged from the Borgia era was fundamentally altered. It was more centralized, more militarized, and infinitely more cynical. Old feudal notions of honor and loyalty were definitively buried, replaced by a cold, sober calculation that Italians would call ragion di Stato, or reason of state. This was a world perfectly primed for the advent of Machiavelli's prince, a world where there was no longer room for gods or illusions, only for the stark, relentless will to power. Behind the bloody facade of the Borgias' deeds lay not merely a hunger for power. Behind it lay an entire philosophical revolution, however unconscious its authors might have been. The central idea that governed everything was simple and terrifying in its novelty. Politics is an autonomous sphere of activity, entirely divorced from morality, religion, and ethics. The Borgias were perhaps the first in European history to approach statecraft not as a sacred duty, but as a precise science, a kind of political mechanics. In their world, there were no concepts of good and evil, sin and virtue. There were only the categories of effective and ineffective. Murdering a cardinal was not an immoral act, but an effective way to replenish the budget. Betraying an ally was not treachery, but a rational optimization of political assets. They crafted a cold, merciless algebra of power. The intellectual engine that translated this bloody practice into the language of timeless philosophy was a man who, perhaps, never spoke personally with Alexander or Cesare, but who became their most brilliant disciple. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. A Florentine diplomat, he witnessed Cesare's ascent and fall. And unlike everyone else, he saw behind Cesare's cruelty not sadism, but a system. Machiavelli was the grey eminence not of the Borgias themselves, but of their legacy. He did not inspire them, they inspired him. His treatise, The Prince, is not the fruit of abstract musings. It is a detailed, almost laboratory-like report on Cesare Borgia's methods. Machiavelli was the thinker who looked at the monster and did not recoil in horror, but instead began to dissect it, to study its anatomy, and to marvel at its perfection. He was the first to understand and articulate that the Borgias had created not merely a new dynasty, but a new science of power. This new, cynical philosophy stood diametrically opposed to the full might of the old world, the entire medieval concept of power. The alternative doctrine proclaimed, a ruler is God's anointed. Their authority is not a right, but a divinely ordained duty. They must be just, merciful, and pious. Their primary goal is not personal enrichment, but the salvation of their subjects' souls and the defense of the true faith. Power, according to this doctrine, was inextricably linked with Christian morality. A king who violated divine laws was not merely a bad ruler. He was a tyrant whom subjects had the right and even the obligation to overthrow. This idea formed the very bedrock upon which the entire European order had rested for 1,000 years. And this ancient idea had its own prophet, its own passionate and fervent defender. This was the Dominican friar from Florence, Girolamo Savonarola. If Cesare embodied cold calculation, Savonarola was the embodiment of blazing faith. In his sermons, which drew the entire city, he fiercely denounced the depravity and corruption of the papal court, calling Alexander VI nothing less than the Antichrist. He called for a crusade against Rome, for the purification of the church by fire and sword. In him, the old theocratic model of the world hurled a desperate challenge at the new, secular, and pragmatic one. This was no mere dispute between two men, it was a clash of two universes. This struggle of ideas very quickly translated into real-world politics. Savonarola, who for a brief period became the de facto ruler of Florence, attempted to build a city of God on earth, founded on strict moral laws. In response, Alexander VI deployed his most potent weapon. He excommunicated Savonarola from the church. This was a classic illustration of how the Borgias wielded a spiritual instrument to achieve an utterly temporal political objective, the elimination of a dangerous adversary. The conflict reached its zenith in the year 1498, when the Florentines, weary of the tyranny of virtue, overthrew Savonarola, and papal legates condemned him to death. The execution of Savonarola, burned in the very piazza where he had once torched sinful books and paintings, became a symbolic act. It marked the triumph of the new philosophy. Pragmatic, secular power, grounded in wealth and force, had vanquished authority based on moral standing and faith. Machiavelli, observing all this unfold, drew his conclusions. Prophets without arms perish. It was at this precise moment that the old world definitively died, and the new world, our modern world, where politics and morality exist in parallel, rarely intersecting universes, began its triumphant march. The summer of 1503. The Borgia juggernaut was operating at full throttle, but it harbored a critical vulnerability woven into its very blueprint. Its absolute reliance on two brilliant minds, a father and his son. Then, one sweltering summer day, the system faltered. Following a feast at Cardinal Adriano da Corneto's palazzo, both Pope Alexander and Cesare were struck down by a virulent fever. Days later, the old pontiff succumbed. At that very instant, the grand system wasn't conquered. Its brain simply ceased to function. The intricate machinery, fueled by his will, his intrigues and his coffers, ground to an immediate halt. There was no external enemy, no decisive battle. The system began to devour itself from within, its creator no longer at the helm. Cesare, though he survived, was chained to his bed, consumed by delirium, precisely when all his formidable energy was needed most. His enemies, whom he had trampled and humiliated for years, scented not just blood, but a void. They weren't hunters who had slain a beast, they were vultures converging on its corpse. The cities of Romagna, which had trembled before the Duke just yesterday, now began to revolt. The condottieri he had spared were once again assembling armies. The Orsini and Colonna returned to Rome. The machine, stripped of its central processor, sputtered to a halt, and its components immediately turned on one another. And thus began the fiercest scramble for his legacy. But the would-be heirs made no attempt to preserve the grand vision. Instead, they carved up his empire into mere souvenirs. Every petty tyrant, every baron, every city-state clamored to snatch a piece of the disintegrating duchy of Romagna. In Rome, the cardinals whom Alexander had once bought wholesale immediately forgot their vows and began playing their own game in the conclave to elect a new pope. Cesare, still ailing, tried to influence the process, but he was no longer the grandmaster. He was merely one of many pieces on the board. He was a lion without fangs or claws, and a pack of hyenas already circled him. The chief predator in this pack was his sworn enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. He proved to be the true inheritor, not of the Borgias' ideals, but of their ruthless methods. He played his hand with brilliant cynicism. First, he championed the election of the weak and ailing Pius III, who passed away in a mere 26 days. Then, at the subsequent conclave, he struck a bargain with a weakened Cesare. He promised to let Cesare retain his title as Duke of Romagna and his position as Commander-in-Chief of the Papal Army in exchange for the votes of the Spanish cardinals loyal to him. Cesare, desperately clinging to power, believed him. The moment della Rovere ascended to become Pope Julius II, he instantly reneged on all his vows. He demanded Cesare surrender all his fortresses in Romagna and, when met with refusal, ordered his arrest. The student had surpassed the master, wielding the master's own chief weapon, betrayal, against him. Cesare's subsequent fate was a tragic epilogue, the chronicle of a titan's downfall. He escaped arrest to Naples, only to be promptly rearrested there and dispatched to Spain. For 2 years, he languished in the impenetrable confines of a fortress. Even from there, legend has it, he managed to escape, lowering himself by a rope woven from bedsheets. But this was no longer the Cesare who had struck terror across Italy. He was a fugitive without an army, without funds, without a state. He was merely a phantom, a shade of his former grandeur, seeking service from anyone willing to pay. The last remnant of that grand design, the final bearer of the dream of a secular kingdom in Italy, met his end in an obscure skirmish outside the walls of the small fortress of Viana in Spanish Navarre. In March of 1507, fighting in the service of his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, he charged alone into a troop of enemy knights, was ambushed and killed. His body, riddled with dozens of lances, was stripped naked and cast into a ravine. The man who had dreamed of becoming King of Italy died as a common mercenary, his unburied remains found only the following day. This inglorious death, in the dirt beneath a foreign sky, was more than merely the end of a man. It was the symbolic demise of the entire Borgia era. The final torchbearer of their titanic, amoral dream was extinguished. The grand system, forged to conquer the world, failed to outlast its creator by even 4 years. It blazed forth like a supernova, blinding all with its brilliance, only to just as swiftly collapse into a black hole, leaving behind nothing but ruins and a terrifying legend. Immediately following the family's demise, their adversaries embarked on a systematic campaign to erase them from history. But this wasn't merely an erasure. It was a substitution. In place of the complex, contradictory yet brilliant figures of Alexander and Cesare, a crude caricature was hoisted up, the Black Legend. Pope Julius II, their warrior successor, spared no effort to portray the Borgia era as an aberration, a nightmare best forgotten. He sealed off the Borgia apartments, lest anyone gaze upon their propagandistic frescoes. Historians, writing at his behest, transformed the astute politician Alexander into a dull libertine, and the brilliant strategist Cesare into a primitive sadist. This legend proved incredibly resilient because it served everyone's agenda. For the Protestants who sparked the Reformation, the Borgias became perfect proof of the utter moral decay of papal Rome. For the Catholics, navigating the Counter-Reformation, they were a shameful stain on the Church's history, best not analyzed but simply condemned and consigned to oblivion. For 3 centuries, the name Borgia wasn't a subject for study. It was a byword for absolute evil. Their primary legacy, the cold scientific technology of seizing and maintaining power, was completely buried under a heap of horrifying yet convenient tales of incest, orgies, and poisons. The world forgot the engineer and remembered only the monster. The moment of rediscovery arrived only in the 19th century, and it happened right there in Italy. The Risorgimento era, the struggle for national unification, was in full swing. Italian patriots, figures like Garibaldi and Mazzini, desperately sought heroes and symbols from the past that could inspire the nation. And suddenly, someone dusted off an old treatise by Niccolò Machiavelli. They read it with entirely new eyes. They saw in Cesare Borgia not merely a tyrant, but the first Italian patriot, the first individual with the audacity and will to attempt what they now dreamed of, expelling foreign powers and forging a unified, strong Italian state. This had the impact of a bombshell. The forgotten adventuring duke suddenly became a banner. Historians and publicists began to re-examine his story. They argued, yes, he was ruthless, but could Italy really be unified with kid gloves? Yes, he was treacherous, but were his enemies angels? They saw him as a tragic hero, a genius 300 years ahead of his time. He was no longer a villain. He became a prophet, albeit a bloody one, of Italian unity. Cesare Borgia was resurrected, pulled from history's crypt, and placed on a pedestal as one of the nation's founding fathers. Yet, this second birth was simultaneously the greatest misinterpretation of his story. The Romantic era, with its cult of passion and national spirit, could not and would not see Cesare for who he truly was. A cold, calculating pragmatist for whom Italy was not a sacred homeland, but merely a convenient playground for the realization of personal dynastic ambitions. The 19th century Romantics took this icy technocrat of power and infused him with their own fiery souls. They ascribed their own ideals to him: patriotism, the dream of a nation, a yearning for a grand future. Great writers such as Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas cemented this new myth in their novels and plays. They transformed the Borgia family members into passionate, suffering, grandiose anti-heroes. This new myth, the myth of the Borgia patriots, proved just as far from reality as the old black legend. But it perfectly suited the demands of its age. And this reveals something astonishing. History is never merely a collection of facts. It is always a mirror in which each new generation attempts to discern its own face, its own fears, and its own dreams. So, we began our journey with a simple, almost forensic question. How did a family of outsiders manage to seize Rome, employing methods more akin to a criminal syndicate's tactics than aristocratic intrigue? And we found the answer. It wasn't about exceptional cruelty or sheer luck. It was about technology. The Borgias created and perfected history's first operating system for total power, where everything from faith to love was merely a variable in a cold equation of efficiency. They cracked the code of control, and that code, it turned out, was terrifyingly simple. And here the circle closes, yet it leads us to a far more unsettling conclusion. Because, having traversed this entire cycle, from brilliant conception to inglorious collapse, we realize that the system they forged never truly vanished. It simply ceased to be shocking. Their methods, which to their contemporaries were unthinkable barbarism, are today studied in business schools and intelligence academies under headings like crisis management, hostile takeovers, and asymmetrical responses. We inhabit a world that speaks the language of the Borgias without even realizing it. Their operating system has become the background program of our civilization, and in this, the central, irresolvable paradox of this entire story is laid bare. The pursuit of absolute rational order inevitably gives birth to the most irrational and bloody chaos. The Borgias were obsessed with the idea of control. They yearned to construct a perfect, predictable, centralized state machine, and for this, they methodically annihilated everything unpredictable: honor, loyalty, trust, morality. But in destroying these, they demolished the very foundation upon which any durable human community can stand. Their system was flawless in its mechanics, but it lacked a soul. It was a pure, distilled how, utterly devoid of an answer to the question, why? And in this lay its inherent, fatal flaw. A machine built for eternal rule proved programmed for self-destruction, because it could offer its creators and subjects nothing but fear and profit. And on such fuel, no system can long endure. And looking at all this from our 21st century, from an era where technologies of control, manipulation and power have reached a level Cesare couldn't have even dreamed of, we see a frightening reflection. The Borgias created groundbreaking software for their time, based on the best available technologies, money, propaganda, and mercenaries. We stand on the cusp of an era where artificial intelligence, total surveillance, and information warfare offer us tools of incomparably greater might. And gazing upon all of this, the paramount question arises: is history a spiral, where we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes on a new technological plane? Are we now merely crafting a more efficient, faster, and more pervasive version of that same Borgia machine, one that will inevitably lead us to an equally grandiose and empty finale? Or does humanity, after all, have a chance to break free from this cycle, remembering that the greatest efficiency is meaningless if, in the final analysis, it serves nothing greater than itself?